Uh, Excellencies, distinguished guests, a good morning to all of you, and we extend a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our online audience for a second round of discussion between a very distinguished number of colleagues who have joined us here at IPI today. And we are delighted to have with us Mark Malloch-Brown, President of the Open Societies Foundations and former Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and Karen Langren, former, I should say, Executive Director of Security Council Report and former Undersecretary General of the UN and many time SRSG. And myself, Zaid Rad Al-Hussein, President of IPI and former Human Rights Commissioner for the UN. We are missing Jan Egeland, who sends his regrets, and he's promised us that he'll be joining us for the third round. Today, as we see across the UN, much of the focus in the news remains on Ukraine, and there is a rising chorus also of concern that other issues are not being dealt with the requisite attention they deserve. Perhaps one can be forgiven, though, for understanding why it is that Ukraine occupies such a central position, given that it sort of harkens. There are elements to it which sort of make one think of July 1914, that only a few steps away from a catastrophe are we when we look at the condition within the country. And that condition remains absolutely perilous. On the humanitarian side, of course, 4 million, more than 4 million people have left the country. Up to 11 million people have been moving within or been displaced. The human rights conditions are frightful. We've seen reports and we've seen also imagery which point to massive indiscriminate shelling, targeting of civilians, use of prohibited weapons like cluster munitions. And that seems to be intensifying in certain places, most especially Mariupol, which is now really being strangled. And the destruction in the city is phenomenal. The military situation seemingly has now consolidated itself to the east, or is consolidating itself basically to the east and southeast, and with some pressure being relieved on the north and northwest. A long train of senior public officials from Europe, most especially, have made their way to Kyiv. Martin Griffith has, of course, been the senior UN official who's been there, and the UN has given a sort of sense that there is a UN presence. But most unusually, the Secretary General has yet to make a trip. The Secretary General exercises powers under Articles 98 and 99 of the UN. There's a peacemaking role, and he has been conspicuously inconspicuous when it comes to his presence. And I hope this is something that he will remedy sometime soon. The Security Council has had many meetings now on Ukraine, largely inconsequential as a result of the repeated use of a veto by the Russians. And only a few days ago, President Zelensky, in addressing the Security Council, launched a blistering attack on it. And he asked whether the UN ought not to be reformed immediately. He said the veto is not a right to die. It needed fairer representation. And he said the aggressor had to be brought to justice. So in a sort of thumbnail sketch of where we've reached over the past month, I'd like to now turn it over to Mark for his reflections. And perhaps, Mark, also, if you could, we could have your reactions to what President Zelensky said. You know, is he right? And if he is right, what should we do?
Well, look, I mean, I think his challenge to the UN, in truth, was reform rather than go away. I mean, he wants an effective UN. And so I think in that sense, it was a really important challenge because he was reminding us, of a UN, perhaps the most fundamental piece of the UN of all. We often go decades almost overlooking, which is its role as an international security organization, and maybe a spectre of a war in Europe, the place where that mission was originally founded, brings it home to us, because we do have a UN which in this crisis and some others as well, gets some decent traction on the humanitarian side, is able to do a good job of documenting crimes on the human rights side. After the conflict, makes a reasonable fist of some development support afterwards. But in that core function of a central role in stopping the conflict, the UN is increasingly, once again, as it was in the Cold War years, absent. And I think he's right to remind us of that. But I do just want to see if there are a few spring shoots. Nice morning like this makes one think, are there a few buds in blossom? And I do think, in addition to the extraordinary standing down of Russia from the Human Rights Council, only the second time, and the first time it's been done to a P5 member, even just the votes yesterday are consequential, so that it didn't get a board seat at UNICEF when it's displaced 2/3 of Ukrainian children is an absolutely correct outcome. That is the UN membership collectively acting with a degree of morality, even if there's always these things, a lot of politics behind it. Or a long overdue throwing of Russia off the UN NGO liaison committee, where it's used that membership to stop human rights and other groups being accredited for many years. These are actually good in a small way for the organization. But then the challenge is, how do we make sure that by raising the club rules in this way, expecting standards and punishing a country that doesn't meet them, we don't betray the universality of the institution? And I think that's the big challenge. And I just want to say a few things about that, because, I think the first thing is the UN needs to balance coming down hard on Russia with a reminder of the benefits for the rest in the club. And that is that it really champions the fact that the only crisis out there is not a European security crisis. There is a wider global economic crisis that the UN should lead on. This current report just out of 1.7 billion people in 107 countries being at risk because of the rises in food and energy prices and inflation and supply chain disruption. The Secretary General's right to call it a silent assault on the developing world. And the UN needs to be right up front in trying to, in a sense, get a global war-level response. The only crisis is not Ukraine. It has triggered this wider crisis, and the UN needs to respond to that as well. The second thing, I think, is to avoid getting drawn into these debates on is it a genocide, isn't it a genocide? I think, in a sense, it's more important to let the facts speak for themselves and to make sure that the right kind of fact gathering is going on. And, when you have a president, Putin, who continues in his public statements to deny the existence of Ukraine as a country, and then you get from a respected Ukrainian journalist who was in Bucha a text like this: at least 25 women and girls as young as 14 were raped by Russians in one basement in Bucha. 9 of them are pregnant. Russians said they would, quote, rape them to the point where they wouldn't want sexual contact with any man to prevent them having Ukrainian children. And, when this kind of brutal sort of thing is happening and being documented, let it speak for itself. Let's make sure this kind of reportage and witness accounts are out there. The third point I just make is, Ukraine is a compounding crisis of 4 or 5, starting with the financial crisis, moving through the trade wars, moving, frankly, through Brexit, moving through the Trump election here. The global economic system that the UN of my day has sort of floated high on, was under assault before we got to this war. This has reinforced the sort of delinking, the decoupling of the global economy in some quite profound ways. But we shouldn't forget that the real issue behind it is not Russia as second-tier economic power and a declining one. It's the US-China relationship. And we really must not take our eye off that ball. And we have to find a way, and I suspect there is some willingness on both sides, to use this moment to find a framework which does not overlook the fact that there is strategic competition between these two countries, but reminds them of their common investment, their common interest in a stable, prosperous, law-based, growing world economy. And if this is the wake-up shock that can reset that relationship, and I know it seems a tall order because the talk here is of how China is sort of giving a nod to Russian actions. I think the Chinese position is more complex than that. I think they have a vested interest in this stable, globalized world, which created the wealth of modern China, and I think we have to find a way and the US has to find a way of engaging, just as China needs to find a way of engaging with the US, because that can again create a platform for a much more, if you like, activist UN. But this does bring me to this, where I began, about those spring shoots, those early April buds of throwing Russia off some of these bodies. Is there a wider way of using that as a thin end of a wedge to have a full summer here of repurposing some of these UN bodies in a way which makes them much more truly representative of the modern membership? That we start to say, more widely, why do P5 nationals have the lock on so many senior posts? Why do these countries automatically get voted on to so many bodies like ACABQ? Let's use this for a wider reset. Why? Because that keeps the world on side. That is part of making this a dispute in the UN, not Russia versus the West, as I think I said last time, Russia versus the rest. And let's see if we could build actions against Russia into that wider effort to begin to tackle some of the long overdue issues. But let me, just as a very final point, just finish on the issue of the UN's direct role. I was talking to Martin Griffiths, who was mentioned earlier, who's just back from Moscow and Kiev, and as always is doing a great and thoughtful job around these issues. But he was reflecting just yesterday back on Yemen, where he spent years as the SRSG. And now suddenly there is a breakthrough there. And Martin's point was, it's not actually that the offers on the table have necessarily changed very much. It's that suddenly, through patience and remaining in the game, suddenly the different parties are ready to do what they weren't ready to do before, which is to find a way out of this hellish struggle. And the UN needs to stay there. But to stay there, it's got to have a profile that is currently missing. The Secretary General needs to go to Kiev. The Secretary General needs to try and get the different sides around the table. And this is a Secretary General who the Russians, I think, have dismissed, and Zelensky has questions about, but he has an obligation under the Charter. And if the UN is to use this to as a way of coming back, of meeting the Zelensky challenge, it needs a Secretary General who raises his profile, takes risk, doesn't limit himself to very welcome condemnations here in New York, but goes to the field and starts an overdue attempt to begin some kind of process to lead to a ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And so, Karen, let's turn over to you, and the same two questions, reactions to Zelensky's comments, and then thoughts you might have on where the UN needs to go.
Thanks, Zaid. And I think we should take a second to acknowledge that this is a moment when all eyes are on the Security Council and on the Charter, and it's created a kind of momentum to do something, to have a stronger institution. And that momentum doesn't come around very often with this 77-year-old Charter and Council. And we're looking at, I think, along a spectrum of possibilities for change. The Zelensky proposal is at one extreme, which is telling the Council that if really all they can do is conversation, perhaps they should dissolve themselves. moving along, there are some reforms that require amending the charter, and a lot of the discussion around changes to the veto or changes to the membership of the council fall there. And then I think there's a third area, which I really want to spend more time on, which is changes that could be made without requiring charter amendment or a great deal of complexity. And that's a set of options that are both changes in working methods and processes and exploring underutilized parts of the charter. And I want to talk a bit about what those are. But to start with the Zelensky proposal, let's call it, I think over the past couple of months, a lot of commentators have come to realize that there is this design aspect of the charter and the council that is not a bug but a feature of the system, and the veto was a condition of entry of the big powers. And ultimately, the charter and the council as set up are not going to prevent a permanent member determined to go to war in defiance of the charter. I think what's often forgotten is just how radical an instrument the charter is, and the Security Council, that coming on the back of World War II and on the back of a failed League of Nations, something was put together which all states wanted to join and voluntarily limit some of their sovereignty, give up some of their decision-making, including in respect of the use of armed conflict, to be bound by decisions of the Security Council. And if that was radical in 1945, I think it's the stuff of fantasy today. So the idea that member states would sit down today, tear up the old one, draft a new one that would be stronger in terms of placing limits on the big powers, I find quite surreal, but I'm open to suggestions otherwise. The second, let's say, basket of options involve amending the charter, which, as we know, requires the concurring votes of the permanent members. So I'm just going to leave that basket of issues there. But it's the third one where I think there are real possibilities. Using processes that don't require formal charter revision, and that would include, for example, the proposal that's now on the table of automatically referring vetoed matters to the GA for an explanation of vote and a debate. It is what the Council did on February 27th when, using the Uniting for Peace process, they sent the Ukraine issue to the GA. The one obligation the Security Council has to the GA is to present an annual report. But for many years, the GA discussion around that report has been a pretty pallid affair. And it could certainly be revitalized in a way that would allow members to work at holding the Council more accountable for the decisions they took over the past year. So there are possibilities there for reasons we can come back to. I think at some point there are limited returns to referring too much to the General Assembly. So we should probably look at that. But if we move on from that, there are also really underutilized parts of the Charter. We think that with Ukraine, the Security Council really went all over the Charter, and in a way it did, citing articles we haven't heard of for a long time. But there are others that they're not using. There's a provision under which a decision under Chapter 6, under Pacific Settlement of Disputes, a party to the conflict is required to abstain from voting on that decision. The Security Council hasn't used it since 1960. Until Ukraine, it was last referred to in discussion in the early 2000s. In the case of Ukraine, one elected member alluded to it without mentioning it by name. Certainly, we think none of the P5 really want to see this provision revived, but it's there if anyone wants to use it. The Council has a lot of power to investigate disputes. We hear, in this age of disinformation, a lot of questions about finding out what the facts are in different situations in Ukraine. Under Article 34, it could do more to initiate investigation of disputes. There's a provision under which a party to a case in the International Court of Justice who feels that the judgment hasn't been implemented can bring that matter to the Security Council to take it further. And of course, as Mark has also alluded to, there's the Secretary General's power under Article 99 to bring to the Council any issue which he feels constitutes a threat to international peace and security. And I think we agree that that could be more upfront in practice than it has been. So, in sum, the Charter needs vigorous defending. Someone needs to call out breaches of international law when they occur and without the double standard that we've seen too much of. Grave violations of the Charter need to carry a higher price than they do, and I don't know what the answer to that is. But I think we have to remember that nothing any of these options will do is going to make the Security Council or a future Security Council into a machine that will stop a permanent member determined to go to war.
So with that, Karen, you remind me, I was driving up from Philadelphia the other day and I was listening to a song by Leonard Cohen. And there was one line where he said, wherever cracks appear, you can always shine lights through them. And I think what we're saying is that cracks in the system are appearing, and the question is how much light can we drive through them to sort of resolve the crack and not to make these cracks worse. I see two problems. I see one problem of an obscene imbalance in power between the member states on the one hand and the Secretariat on the other. The member states are far too powerful than is good for them, vis-a-vis a Secretariat that's far too willing to allow the member states to be too powerful. And this is something that has to be redressed. The member states, not just the P5, but all member states, need to understand that there is power in giving away power to the Secretariat, to the specialized agencies, to the staff who are working in the field. It is amazing to me that the data, the reports from the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, 32 reports, never really made it into the mainstream press as being an authoritative sort of narrative reflecting what is happening in the human rights condition in Ukraine, and why the Russian Federation should be given the space to even sort of give any legitimacy to its claims when the UN has these authoritative reports is just a sign of how weak the Secretariat is relative to the member states. The second thing is I think I sort of tend to go more in Mark's direction, that if this is an opportunity, and we see what's happening with the Liechtenstein proposal and the 32 co-sponsors, that there is this sort of movement now on within the General Assembly that we should actually think extremely boldly. No member state has withdrawn from the UN. No member state has withdrawn from the mechanisms, the human rights mechanisms. You know, some member states have withdrawn from sort of regional bodies and have threatened withdrawal from some of the treaty bodies. Once you're locked in, if you begin to think, well, we withdraw from the Security Council or withdraw from the UN, there's so many regulations that you're connected into. It's a nightmare to think that you can really do it. So I think once locked in, it's difficult. You can say it, you can declare it, you can even think it, but to actually do it, I think it's quite difficult. I mean, the Trump administration withdrew from the Human Rights Council. It did not withdraw from human rights. It still did its UPR at the end of the Trump administration, and they're still involved. So I think that we can not worry about. My wish list, and this is completely, you might think I'm totally insane, I think we have to look like this. One-term Secretary Generalship, charter amendment. The two-term, I think, is, has so many problems related to it. Of course, we can luck out and you can have a Kofi Annan and you'd want to see him serve 2 terms. But I think a 1-term strategically is a better option. We need a 2-chamber Security Council. 1 chamber to handle the complete workload is too much. 2 chambers, same rotation, same membership, needs to be maintained. But I would make the argument that if you have a 1 chamber for maintenance issues and sanctions, that it be limited only to the P5, and that the first chamber that deals with the centrifugal, dangerous crises should have a possible expansion to it. The veto should remain intact, but, and this is where I think it makes sense, the General Assembly should have a veto override, maybe 7/8, 3/4, beyond where we're going now. And I think the President of the General Assembly needs to be restored to the position that that they had initially, but they have to be selected far more carefully, and they would serve 2 terms. So we went through a long period where the presidents of the General Assembly, there were exceptions, were generally seen as almost ceremonial positions, and I think that needs to be changed. But I think the moment is for that sort of thing, and of course we'd never achieve not even close to this, but if you aim high, you might get somewhere quite reasonable. I see Mark frowning.
Well, no, I'm thinking it through. I mean, the 2-chamber bit is I'm struggling a bit with. Karen would have to double her staff to cover it. But look, no, I mean, and I suspect for all of us, ultimately, you've got to divide the changes into what really requires reopening the Charter and what can you do without reopening the Charter.
Yeah.
Yeah, just 2 points on that. I think we can all agree that it would be great to have a more empowered secretariat.
Yeah.
That doesn't require amending anything. No. It requires a change of perspective. Maybe it requires staffing changes, but it is what should happen. Coming back to the General Assembly, though, I think it's been clear from the issues that have been referred to it recently that member states as a whole are going to get tired pretty quickly of being lobbied heavily by all sides with every vote. You don't want to have to be doing that every week, either being lobbied or doing the lobbying. That's a full-time occupation. And we may say, from our perspective, well, as a member state of the UN, you have to stand up and be counted. You have to take a position on these fundamental issues of the Charter. But if I were an abstaining member state, I might look at what's going on in the Security Council and say, there are some extremely powerful states there who are choosing to abstain and say, we are not taking a position on this issue, so why should I, crushed between this side and that, actually have to choose? So I have questions about asking the GA to do too much, at least in the current state of affairs, and even on the veto, shift proposal. I'm sure that's not what they're calling it. I think there has been some success in attaching a degree of stigma to the use of the veto. Now, you may say, well, that's gone, but as long as that is still there, I would have a concern that where there's automatic referral to the GA, council members wanting to deploy the veto can comfort themselves that, well, it's going for discussion in the GA, so it's not so bad that we're killing it in the council.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, Karen, I mean, I think the Security Council has had such a loss of legitimacy over this crisis, which compounds so many other mishandled crises before, that, I mean, we all know the shortcomings of the GA too, but, I think that reassertion of its representativeness of the global membership is overdue. And I think, I still draw the line, as I implied just now, as do you, at let's do everything up to the limit of where we have to reopen the Charter. But if we were ever close to a San Francisco moment, it is now. And it seems to me we're close enough for internal reforms. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mentioned all these shocks to the global system, and I didn't even mention COVID, which arguably is the biggest. So you had this compounding economic shock, which is going to have devastating consequences along large parts of the world. And then you have a P5 member basically go completely rogue and off-piste and break every fundamental cardinal rule of the system. I mean, if ever there was a moment for leadership to say, this is a time for a reboot, it should be this. And I think that's, what we have to look to a Secretary General to, and to smart ambassadors. I mean, Christian, who was here the last time we did this, I mean, the Liechtenstein proposal is what happens when you have an ambassador who's really been here a long time, knows his way around. I mean, it's very clever. And, I'm thrilled it's got 32 co-sponsors, and I understand the US is on side for it. I mean, that's some really interesting momentum that I think we shouldn't, we in a sense at this stage, you certainly don't want, and I'm sure with Christian it's not an impractical proposal, but you want to, you want to push as much as you can. The time for pulling back a bit later and fine-tuning it as to how it would actually work, I think comes later, but just use this moment of energy and sentiment for reform to its maximum, I think.
Can I?
Yeah.
It's not that we've decided you're insane.
No.
But if I can come back on that with a couple of things. I think one of the frustrations of the membership with the Security Council, apart from the legitimacy aspect, is that you have the Council saying repeatedly, no, this issue is not international peace and security, it's something else.
Yeah.
Whether that's pandemics or climate, or they're able to say, oh, that's human rights, that's development. When you have a lot of members saying, no, this is what we mean when we talk about security.
Yeah.
And there's a strong perception that the Council isn't listening to that, isn't hearing what, for most countries now, is part of a security threat to them. But it also means the general membership stepping up and engaging more with the Council in that debate. And the last thing I'll say is our common agenda. Our common agenda has a lot of proposals that I would describe as reform adjacent. They don't use the word reform, but there's a real vision there around things that need to happen and bringing in future generations. And that is something, if implemented, could strengthen both the dialogue possibilities, the emergency response possibilities, and the strengthening of international law.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Listening to you both, it's a question of how you trigger all of this. I mean, Mark, you said, the Secretary General could really take the lead here. Because I think from the experiences we've all had in the UN when we were senior officials, you get a sense that the membership is desperate for leadership from the Secretariat. And initially, the membership will be reserved and drawing its own calculations. I mean, I'll give you an example. When the war began in Yemen, and we, in my previous capacity, we pushed very early on for an independent investigation, and the membership wasn't ready for it. But we were pushing for it publicly. And then the second year, the thought that there should be one, gained currency. And so the membership is slow sometimes to come around an idea. But if there is the cover at the top, then that can happen. I think that all previous Secretary Generals were able to do this. And that's what we essentially need here, I think.
I think so. And obviously being lucky enough to have served under Kofi, I mean, I saw this in spades, his skill at finding that way through that proposal, which, even if it got sat on first time, had a capacity to come back. And he saw the daylight, he saw the glint of space between the two sides through which you could move. I did want to take up, Karen, though, on one point about these sort of non-classic security threats coming to the Security Council. Because when we were young colleagues in UNHCR and I was working with the Indo-Chinese, Cambodians, you know, the reason we were able to do all the things we did was because there was a sort of basic sort of deal to let us do it between the P5, but an absolute expectation that we'd never embarrass them by bringing it in front of them in the Security Council, because that would have invited a kind of Cold War deadlock. So, you know, in that time, these big humanitarian issues were dealt with under international humanitarian law. You know, I would go around, you know, with my charter in my back pocket and, you know, other appropriate documents to wave at Thai border officials who were about to refool refugees. And there was never any suggestion one would refer to a Security Council decision. And I've always been, actually, to be honest, worried by the overexpansion of what's brought to the council, because if then you subject it to this sort of politicization and weaponization. And so I've always felt the example of Syria is a good one, where I actually think if you hadn't been looking for Security Council endorsement of the humanitarian operations in Syria, you would have had much more expansive cross-border efforts to reach affected populations than what you were limited to by the ability of Damascus to use its Russian proxy in the Security Council to critically inhibit the reach of these humanitarian operations. So I sort of slightly feel we should be slightly worried what we wish for when we allow too many things to be branded security issues and brought to the council.
I think we agreed last time on the inadvisability of the council getting too far into humanitarian things, because it risks becoming a proxy for the issues they aren't able to address, the political issues that they aren't able to.
And I sit between you, a very embarrassed former member of the Security Council, who, together with the ambassadors of Luxembourg and Australia, and having worked with the UK mission as well, was the penholder on this particular issue on humanitarian access. I don't think at the time we foresaw how the emphasis on this would grow. At the time, we were dealing with Ukraine first round, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and in all of these crises, we had to deal with the Syrian crisis, and it seemed to be a point at which we could have agreement. And I think this is why it's expanded so broadly in the context of the UN, the Security Council discussion, because there's precious little to agree on beyond it. And but I think this is where the Secretariat has a special responsibility. In my experience in 2014, when Lakhdar Brahimi came to brief us in his final briefing before he left as Special Envoy for Syria, it was very emotional for him after all the years of service with the UN. And we went around the table in informal consultations, and a few of the colleagues asked him, Mr. Brahimi, what would you have the Security Council do? And he said to us something along the lines of, you know, look, I've presented you with the facts. I mean, essentially, do your job. I mean, you know, the tendency for the membership to always ask, you know, be looking desperately for the Secretariat, when in one way they need to exercise their own prerogatives in the right direction. It's true. But he was also, I think, missing an opportunity, because I think and I would have probably said the same thing he said, if the Secretariat were to say, we're coming back, I'm reporting to the Secretary General, we're coming back in 48 hours with a series of ideas which we'll send to you independently. 15 separate missions will receive a white paper on ideas over Syria. That would have been welcomed. Clearly, any representation directly to the Security Council would have met with opposition from perhaps Russia and China and beyond that. But there are moments that can be seized upon, and I think we need to be alive to them. I similarly think that the UN has 70 years worth of experience, an enormous repository of experience, that it needs to somehow be there in the mediation exercises that are taking place, yes, on the escape corridors, on, off every day, but then beyond that, we know what's going to happen. There are going to be these pauses where both sides need space, and if the UN is fully equipped with a whole battery of practical arrangements, then they can seize that moment and create a space where the UN is a player, as opposed to have a sort of motley collection of mediation exercises or mediators from many other countries as well. And ultimately, in the exchanges that will have to take place as you move to some sort of ending of this, you will have to give up punitive measures for withdrawal, for disengagement, and who is going to make that decision on which punitive measure is given up at what stage and at what point? And so there would have to also be a singular or 2 or 3 central mediators, and one would hope the UN is one of them, no?
Yeah. I suspect one does hope so. I mean, it's first division stuff, and I think it will need some nation states in there with I think possibly Turkey, but others as well. China possibly. We discussed that I think last time as to who might be the countries that could support. But yeah, I think the UN needs to be central to it. And I remember Kofi would always be nervous about the sort of commitments, both in terms of the allegations made at the front end of a crisis, which made it harder to sort of pull back and get an exit ramp because everybody committed themselves that the leader involved was a war criminal. But then on the other hand, also the early promises made about protection against, about impunity and protection from those crimes, which when you actually get to the peace agreement, you actually want to reverse because the crimes are so heinous. So the UN in the middle of this, helping to navigate all this, and get to a just outcome, as I agree with you, they're completely critical and obviously not there at the moment, or at least not to the visible eye there.
Sorry, Karen.
Well, just to close out the humanitarian issue, I think we have to acknowledge something that feels like it's changed since the 80s and 90s, which is the politicized use of humanitarian support. So when it becomes an attempt to break a siege that's being imposed as part of a conflict, of course, it goes beyond the humanitarian. And this is one of the reasons we've seen the Council get more involved in those issues.
Yeah. But maybe there's a balance, Karen. Maybe there's a reassertion of the humanitarian law principles of civilian protection and access to assistance, which the Council kind of pledges to respect. So yes, the humanitarian is part of a broader Council approach to peacemaking, but there are certain norms and principles around access to at-risk civilian populations, which stay the Council from these acts like we saw in Syria, which deny those populations support. So you could imagine a little bit of a balance where, yes, there's a Council resolution, but yes, there's respect for norms of humanitarian action.
I mean, this is the nub of the issue, respecting norms that already exist, right? And thinking about whether some sort of reset is possible right now that brings countries back to the Charter, back to respect for international law. I do have to ask whether a renewed pledge by the current members carries value.
Well, yes, I think there are 1 or 2 members who, there'd certainly be eyebrows raised if they made it. And therefore, again, I think it comes to this issue that, at just beneath the Charter level, can we stimulate enough sense that the UN has failed to rise to this crisis, that we need to sort of repurpose it? And that's around the issues I raised at the beginning about membership of different bodies, but it's also about reassertion of norms, which, as you correctly say, Karen, are already there in the Charter. But have we reached that moment where the crisis is seen as so profound for the future of the institution that unless like-minded come together and make those commitments and isolate those who resist them, we can't move forward? And again, I come back to it. For me, the core relationship as to whether you could get there is actually US-China. And that's difficult because I don't think the Chinese would put top of their agenda the protection of humanitarian norms. But that's what discussion and negotiation is about.
But the system is so intricate. I mean, we think of the system as being simply the humanitarian agenda and the in New York, or when you look at the Security Council agenda, a disproportionate number of agenda items refer to Africa. When you have all the other sort of exclusion zones, I've always said, why are we not discussing Kashmir, right? Why does a similar agreement somehow exclude the UN from a discussion on Kashmir, right? And not just Kashmir, but other exclusion zones. And so it's sharply focused on the humanitarian. And yet you have so many other bodies that regulate the way we do things. I mean, I keep referring to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and you have a category of regulations, once passed, binding law, hard law in all countries, not debated in Congress or in the House of Commons or any parliament, because no one wants to get on a plane that crashes into another plane. Right? So we do accept that this is a system which is bound sort of almost with these tentacles in every part of life. And it's difficult to imagine a country, a member state, stepping out of the system, even if out of political pique, it's upset with one thing or the other, because otherwise its whole trading relationship with the rest of the world begins to collapse, and the financial architecture as well. So I think there is an inbuilt sort of, it's difficult to step, it's not the League where, the 8 countries stepped away. It's difficult for China to move. I think what needs to be done, though, is that on the human rights side, if the UN is not clear and morally consistent on that, the pressure shifts to the humanitarians, and then the humanitarians are in an impossible situation. And we need to have a sort of every part of this system, all the pillars working, to their maximum efficiency, and then it sort of works quite well. And I could see this. If we didn't say something, the pressure is on the humanitarians to say something, and then they are absolutely trapped.
But of course, I mean, I think part of this is that you need to think of the system as not just the UN, but the Bretton Woods institutions as well, because that's where so much of the, if you like, the positive value of membership comes, is during an economic crisis of the kind I've suggested, maybe barreling down at us. The role of the IMF and the World Bank, is going to be critical. And it's interesting that the World Bank and the IMF have followed the UN in terms of isolating Russia. So they're sort of, pursuing a similar set of club rules. If you're a member in good standing, there is great economic benefit at a time of crisis of being part of the club. If you're not,
that's right.
And so I think that, remains, a critical part of this, is to keep on raising value. And the other thing I just say is, we look at it as a crisis, the UN institutions, but behind it, of course, is, and again, I think we may have said this last time, but, I'm hearing the word non-aligned at the UN much more than I have in a generation, frankly. And, it is around countries quite understandably not wanting to get caught into this old framework of a kind of Europe war and a Cold War 2-block system. But how do you get that sort of non-aligned back on side? You do it through this renewal of the institution to give them enhanced decision-making, to make them feel part of it. So, in a way, a successful UN is a kind of US-China piece of agreeing a framework, and then it's a US-China and the non-aligned piece, a triangle way in a way, and non-aligned at its widest, including smaller European countries, etc.
Your point about consistency is so important. And I think there too, the Secretariat has a role in elevating the conflicts and issues that haven't been examined as much, or where violations of the Charter haven't been called out as much as we're seeing them called out now over Ukraine. And to your point, Mark, on the system, I think it is healthy to remember that the Security Council is one part of the system. It's not going to drive everything. But I would go even broader. If we look at the sanctions being applied now, these are not UN sanctions. They are another system out there coming together and agreeing that these things have to be done in the current crisis. So I think taking in that whole breadth of the system, and to your US-China point, whenever we come back to the notion that we could design a better world order by starting afresh, And we haven't really dwelled on that point because I don't think any of us believe that that's a possibility. But it's important to remember that if this is reopened, different powerful actors want very different things out of a new world order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a sobering point to end on. Before we end, though, we invited our in-person audience last time to comment. If anyone here would like to say anything, please, the microphone is live, and we'd be happy for any comments. And if not, then as we close this discussion, we hope that we will do this periodically and invite guests to join us. So it's not just the three of us, four of us, but others too, to offer their opinions. And clearly, this particular period is one where we may see a great deal of creative thought. What happens to it in the end will be a matter of debate. But we thank all of you who are here and all our online audience for watching us, for being part of this. And we hope that you will join us in the future as well. And I wanted to thank, finally, of course, Mark and Karen for joining us today. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.